Okay, inshallah, I was given quite a lengthy title about the Trojan horse, and I have amended it. I hope that's okay. And I just want to talk more about Muslims' education in the British state. So what I've been asked to talk about is the relationship between what happens between a state and an organic community project, and how the two sort of interrelate. So that's what I'm going to do today, inshallah. So just to sorry, this seems to be going the okay, apologies for this. I'm just going to have to go back to the beginning of the presentation. I think it's got to the end somehow. All right, that's the beginning. Okay, so now, okay. So I want to introduce a little bit about the community project, which is called Islamic Shakhsiyah Foundation. And it began in the late 1990s with a network of homeschooling Muslim mothers, which developed across London and Slough. And for some of us, at least, I can say for me, I had that experience from that quote yesterday, where when I had my children, the last thing I wanted to do was put this pure little soul in the hands of a huge system which I did not trust. So it began with unhappiness to do with our own educational experiences, the rigid nature of the state system, and perhaps an idealistic and naive sort of drive to give children an authentic Islamic education, certainly an education which is very different to what you will find in the schooling sector in the UK. So an alternative approach was taken, including the first thing we sort of latched onto, if you like, is the idea that what the Prophet ﷺ did in Makkah and in Medina was give halakha. So halakha became quite early on the cornerstone of what we began to do with our children. And that being based on traditional Islamic oral pedagogy, but then developed and adapted to meet the needs of children, and in the children certainly in the UK context. The purpose of halakha was, as opposed to Islamic studies, was to contextualize Islam so that it had meaning. So Islam was not taught devoid of, in a theoretical kind of way, in a knowledge-based kind of way, that this is what Islam is, this is the Imam Mufassal, and this is what you believe, and this is what the 5 pillars are, and so on. It wasn't taught in that kind of way. It was much more dynamic, much more engaging, much more to do with what children would have experienced and what it meant for them. And the context of being that we're growing up, these children, they live in this country, this is the society that they're functioning in, and how does Islam impact them here? What does it mean for them to be a Muslim here? And so to give children the time and the freedom to discuss and debate these ideas, see different perspectives and reach their own conclusions, which obviously when we started out, we're talking about 3 to 4 year olds, wasn't quite what was happening, but as they grew, that is something that they learned to do. So in 2002, by that stage, we had a network which was, we had I'd say about 8 to 10 groups ranging from Slough across West London into North and East London. And the decision was taken at that time because after, obviously, 9/11, you had, there was a certain amount of nervousness about kids gathering in homes and in, porter cabins behind masjids, and a little bit here and a little bit there, and there was a sense of nervousness that, we're growing, it's getting bigger, we should probably take on some sort of identity so that we can say, well, this is it, this is what we're doing, if we're asked questions. So we decided to, there was quite a lot of discussion, and we decided to register 2 independent schools as Islamic Shakhsiyah Foundation, and it was quite intentional with amongst the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people who began that out, not to use the word school in there, but we knew that the best thing to register was actually was independent schools. We weren't that aware that you could do things like flexi schooling and so on. So there was a decision taken to do that. At the time, we were unaware that there was a major consultation going on by the government about the independent school standards. So we got hold of the independent school standards. We looked at them. They were about 10 pages long, and they basically said that you could do whatever you like, and so long as you told the government the odd thing now and again, an Ofsted will come and visit you, you can do what you want. And it was very open, it was very free. So we thought, okay, this is fine. We can do this. There's not a problem. unaware that this consultation going on, 6 months after filling in the application form and putting together this organisation and so on, a package landed through the door, which this thick, 190 new regulations for independent schools. And I think even at that time we thought, okay, is this what we want to do? And for better or for worse, we decided to go forward with it because we looked through that and thought, well, these are health and safety. Is this your curriculum here? We're doing this kind of stuff. We can do this. This is not too difficult. But that journey, what then happens afterwards is the interesting bit. So as soon as you become an organisation, as soon as you register, as soon as you become a body, and the state then gets involved, that's what I'm going to talk about today. Just before I go on, I also want to say that in 2005, we did publish a halakha curriculum, which literally was a list of concepts and topics that children should cover, depending on sort of like, it wasn't even by age group then. We had these groups by colour, so it was red, yellow, blue, green, and it wasn't done by age at that time, although it now is. But it was done by, what level, I suppose, of thinking or discussion the children should have, so more by ability or interest. But we did publish a loose sort of curriculum to guide the teachers as to what should be happening in halakas, because we did realise that some teachers would just spend the whole year talking about Tawheed and didn't really get beyond that, so we need more than that. So that was something that becomes important later. But that nevertheless was very different, the idea being that should be very different to Islamic studies textbooks. So now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the broader picture before I come back to the case study, which is Islamic Shakhsiyah Foundation. So I want to quote, most of the next few slides are from an article by Professor Robin Alexander, and I'll give you the reference, and there's also a link to it on the web. You can actually access this article. So I'm taking some points that he makes about this because it kind of charts what's happened in the UK education sector wide, and we need to have that framework before we narrow down as to what's happening with the state and Muslim education. So what's happening with the state and education full stop. So to begin with, there's a quote given in this article from the Chartist leader William Lovett in 1840, who said, "While we are anxious to see a general system of education adopted," so this is at the beginnings of a state education system coming about in the United Kingdom, "we have no doubt of the impropriety of yielding such an important duty as the education of our children to any government." So that quote about a parent not wanting to, give their child's soul into a system now was being considered on a mass level of all our children's soul. Do we want to give them over to a system which is run by a government? And if ever knavery and hypocrisy succeed in establishing the centralising, state-moulding and knowledge-forcing scheme in England, so assuredly will the people degenerate into passive submission to injustice. So a warning being given that what an education system controlled by the government is going to lead to is a passive submission to injustice. And the spirit will sink into and I love this quote, pestilential calm of despotism. So the idea being that despotism will, even though it's pestilential, there will be such a calm about it that nobody will even recognise that it's there. So coming forward now, what's been happening? And this is a quote from a series of academics who in 2008 wrote a letter to the Independent, and there's a group of them. And what they say there, they say, "We are specialists with considerable experience of the different phases of education who have come independently." So they've come together, but the conclusion that they're saying, they came to that conclusion independently. "We have come independently to the same conclusion that government policy is no longer the solution to the difficulties we face, but our greatest problem. It is not only the torrent of new policy that rains down on each sector," and this raining down of policy on each sector is something that I'd like you to sort of hold in your mind, is because we're going to keep coming back to that. "The constant changes in direction and the automatic rubbishing of any discomforting evidence. It is also the failure of successive ministers to appreciate that reform has to be accompanied by continuity if the stability of our educational institutions and the quality of their courses are to be preserved." So this is a concern that's being voiced in 2008, that there's something going very, very wrong. So what's happened to make this bring this situation about. So I'm going to talk about two things. One is the way that control and centralization has grown over time, and then the level of bureaucracy and interference in the English education system, and finally about privatizing. So to begin with, looking at the growing control and centralization, Robert Alexander gives an interesting sort of timeline, which I've summarized here. And he talks about how in the 1950s, Attlee's Minister of Education at that time, the Lancastrian MP George Tomlinson, famously said, "Minister knows naught about curriculum." And this was a statement of legal fact, not ignorance. So he was not saying that I'm an ignorant person, I don't know anything about what to do with what should be curriculum in schools, but he's basically saying that legally in the 1950s, it is not for the Minister of Education to dictate what should happen in the curriculum in the classroom. So government provided the administrative framework, but local authorities and schools decided what and how to teach, and even the inspectors would not dream of saying to a school, this is what you should be teaching, or this is what needs to be in your curriculum. In the 1960s, the Education Minister, Tony Crosland, who introduced sweeping changes to other aspects of English education, nevertheless respected this compact and he said, "I didn't regard either myself or my officials as competent to interfere with the curriculum." By the 1980s, this is where you get the watershed, because this is in the Thatcher's government 1987 Education Reform Bill, which became law in 1988, that the national curriculum was finally sort of set about. And at that time, it's interesting what the Labour opposition education shadow, who was Jack Straw at that time, had to say about it. And he said that under the disguise of fine phrases like parental choice and decentralisation, it, referring to the first UK national curriculum, would deny choice and instead centralise power and control over schools, colleges and universities in the hands of the Secretary of State in a manner without parallel in the Western world. So even at that point, the point he's making is that not only are we devising a curriculum, but the power being given to the Secretary of State is more than what's happening elsewhere in the Western world. Of course, when Labour comes to power, the situation changes, and Jack Straw's not the Minister of Education, but nevertheless, what Tony Blair does is very different. So in 1991, echoing Crosland, Education Secretary Kenneth Clarke said questions about how to teach are not for government, so we're not talking about curriculum now, we're talking about pedagogy, are not for government to determine. But just 6 years later, Tony Blair stormed into government with the slogan "Education, Education, Education," and imposed closely prescribed daily literacy and numeracy lessons on every primary school in England, and these told teachers not just what to teach, but minute by minute how to teach it. Right, so now we've gone to the point where every single thing that's happening in a classroom is being prescribed by government. And in the 2010s, if you fast forward to 2013, by this stage, Secretary of State Michael Gove is able to, in a very sort of insinuating way, say he's laying it on the line, lobbying on his trademark insults. He says, "We have stripped out," he's referring to the new national curriculum, "we have stripped out the piously vapid happy talk and instead laid out the knowledge that every child is entitled to expect they be taught." Okay, so you can see this transfer from 1950 to the 2010s of power. Coming on to the levels of bureaucracy, just one sort of example that will highlight to you what's happened is the phrase "rains down" that I asked you to think about in that letter to the Independent. The torrent of new policies that rains down is not mere hyperbole. Between 1996 and 2004, so in a period of, 6 years, England's primary schools received 459 official documents on literacy alone from government. That's over one a week. And that's just literacy, even before we start counting the many directives on numeracy and other matters in which government also believed it necessary to intervene. So we're talking about a huge amount of bureaucracy being thrown at schools at a rate that you cannot sort of begin to fathom unless you're in the school and trying to deal with it. In 2012, I'm coming on now to what the move is not just for centralisation, but the sort of surface kind of discussion under which the centralisation is taking place is about privatisation and market forces, and they don't call it market forces or capitalisation. They actually talk about parental choice as opposed to consumer choice. But that's what's really happening. So 2012, Christine Blower, General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, says she's alarmed by the pace at which ministers wanted schools to cut links with their local authorities and become academies and free schools. She predicted the privatisation of the English education system by 2015. In fact, actually one of the aims set out in various government documents since Michael Gove became Secretary of State. Academies and free schools are accountable to the Education Secretary directly rather than their local authority, and have greater freedom to change the timings of the school day, teachers' pay and the subjects they teach. On the surface, it looks like schools have been given freedom, but in practice what's actually happening is that power is being centralised in the hands of the Secretary of State. Some 40% of secondary schools in England are now academies, and Michael Gove, Education Secretary, has recently come under renewed attack for forcing Downhills, a primary school in North London, to turn into an academy. And it wasn't just Downhills. Many schools were found inadequate, and some schools have raised even questions about how and why Ofsted found them inadequate, and that was then used as an excuse to force them to come out of local authority control and become academies and free schools. So now they're controlled directly by central government, and there's no middle layer to take government into account. Blower said her union was examining whether it was possible to use the tribunal system to challenge the government's moves to force schools to become academies. When we start looking at the Muslim schools issue, we'll start seeing whether there is any recourse to legal action or not, really. That's the question. So coming on to Muslim education in the British state, before I start discussing what's been going on over the past sort of 5 to 10 years regards to Muslims, I want to just talk a little bit about the foundational concepts of Islamic Shakhsiyya Foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory that's underpinning our work and what it is we're doing, so you get an understanding of what begins to start appearing to be threatening to government, if you like. So we have some foundational concepts that developing Iman needs to be contextualized within the individual Muslim's reality to have an effective impact on his or her life. So Iman is established by relating the Aqidah to all the complexities of an individual child's contextualized growth and development through tarbiyah. Our second principle is that knowledge of Islam, or a second sort of concept, if you like, and I'm coming on to some principles in a minute. Knowledge of Islam, of Islamic concepts and ahkam sharia is required through ta'lim. Ta'lim inculcates Islam, which requires inward and outward submission through amal, actions, as is stated repeatedly in the Quran. And we also have this concept of the inner dimensions of an individual shakhsiyah are developed through ta'deeb in order to attain ihsan, adab and akhlaq. And listening to Maulana Shams yesterday, I was seeing the parallels in this between aql, naql and tasawwuf that is there in the Deobandi tradition and the wider Muslim tradition. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about principles of Shakhsiyya education, so what we do, if you like, in practice, or how our practice is shaped by certain principles. So we have 7 principles, the first one being niyyah, intention, the principle of loving learning for the sake of Allah and growing towards Allah is the ultimate purpose of the human being. I'm not going to go into each of these in depth. I'm going to focus on 2, which is going to be halakha and taqdeer, but I can answer questions about this later. The second principle is of shakhsiyya, that what we're in the business of is personalized character education, of a dynamic parent-teacher-learner relationship. So it's not the parent handing the child over to the teacher or to the school or to an organization, but the parent is in theory heavily involved in the relationship with the learning and the tarbiyah of their child through this personalized shakhsiyya education. Qadwa, teaching by example, that the leadership of the teacher and taking on that responsibility, that your own character and your own knowledge has an impact on the children that you're caring for. Halakha, which is obviously, like I said, the cornerstone of our curriculum and what we're doing. And because the nature of halakha, what we do in halakha is open. So the curriculum is literally a list of topics and concepts. And there's nothing beyond that. And well, there was nothing beyond that. So teachers had the freedom to do what they wanted to do with that, so long as they covered these topics and concepts in a full academic year. That becomes an issue, right? Minhaj al-Darasiyya, there's a Shakhsiyya creative curriculum, so it's a holistic Islamic creative curriculum, a thematic-based curriculum with a halakha curriculum at its core. And this is now, halakha starts becoming much more impacting the curriculum in a more direct kind of way. Balagha, Quranic eloquence, so we have a big program of Quranic Arabic which is infused into the curriculum and learning as well. And taqdeer, which is assessment for the learner, so the principle of individual learner, the shakhs at the heart of assessment, so that assessment is formative only, and we really have no sort of concept of a summative or assessment or a league table of assessment or testing or anything like that. We don't do that. We're dealing with primary age children. We just think that is actually irrelevant to their education, and this becomes an issue. Okay. So those are the two things I want to forward sort of focus on. So looking at halakha, there's an image, probably not the best one, but it's the only one I could find of halakha in Shakhsiyya schools. So you're literally sitting on a floor with a circle. Most classes start this every morning, and we have assembly as a whole school, but then children go and sit in a circle with their teacher, and they start discussing Islam. But it's not just Islam. So they're covering what you would be called PSHE, citizenship, RE, and actually history through halakha, and then what they're discussing in halakha will then feed into other lessons. So they may well take that topic into English and take it even into science and other subjects and so on. Right. So this is what is like the foundation of what we're doing, and we see this as trying to fulfill some of those concepts that have been discussed over the course of this weekend. Okay, so coming back to this diagram about how the halakha curriculum is organized, so we have like 4 different aspects which feed into developing Shakhsiyya Islamiyya, which is at the center. And one thing that is really important is the hifz aspect of it. So the hifz is incorporated in the halakha curriculum. So you have a list of what Quran children memorize, hadith, dua, and adhkar as well. And then, like I talked about, tarbiyah, contextualizing Islam. Now that covers, interestingly enough, back in 2005, we were talking about Muslims in Britain. And there's a whole section of the curriculum which talks about understanding the British context, understanding concepts such as democracy and so on. This actually becomes a problem, interestingly enough. So we're talking about giving children understanding of the institutions that they and the society that they live in, and we're one of the first sort of Muslim educational organisations to do this in the UK, and this becomes an issue, right? Then obviously we have Ta'aleem, which is developing the aql and the naql as well, the knowledge of Islam. And we have Ta'deeb, which is about ihsan, and I'm not going to discuss too much about that. But in Ta'aleem, we don't just restrict this to the traditional Islamic studies of Aqeedah and 5 pillars and so on, and learning about the prophets. That there is an element, because we believe that Islam is a deen, is a way of life, of the muamalat. And us bringing in, we have a section called Ahkam Sharia, which now comes under the spotlight, where you talk about the transactions of Muslims, and you talk about things like, money and riba and alcohol being haram to sell, and you talk about a ruling and what are the principles of ruling in Islam and the accountability of the ruler, and these kinds of aspects are discussed as concepts, not just in stories of the prophets or so on. And this becomes a big issue. Okay. So what happens, right? And so from 2002, when we registered, to 2009, I would describe our experience with Ofsted as fairly normal, whatever that might mean, right? That means it wasn't any different to, I suppose, what a school that's doing things differently with an alternative ethos is facing. So there was a lot of frustration. Ofsted had big problems with the fact that we don't have a testing system, we don't have a tracking system, we're not leveling the children, we're not saying that this is what their progress is, there's no charts, there's no data. We are now at the point, and I'll come on to it, where we have purchased a huge data tracking software, and we are succumbing to Ofsted because the state has managed to pin us down and control us to that basis. We don't have a choice, okay? But this was one of the issues that came about. Interestingly enough, from 2002 to 2009, we have a hugely positive response to the halakha and the halakha curriculum, okay? There is no issue from Ofsted. The reports, if you see, were praising what we're doing, and they're very happy about it, and we're getting good in every Ofsted. Although we had issues with other things, we're getting good for SMSE, which is a spiritual, moral, social, cultural development. In 2007, there's a little bit of negative media that happens about the school's halakha. And what this comes down to is that some of the Muslim mums that have been involved in this were at some point members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, right? So this becomes the focus of the media sort of issue. It doesn't really take off steam. It kind of just comes and goes. At the same time, we actually had involved an organisation called Teachers TV to come and make a film about the school, which you can see on the internet, and that is a really positive sort of engagement we have with the media. In 2009, Civitas, which is a think tank, I think they've been succeeded by the Henry Jackson Society, and another think tank called Centre of Social Cohesion published a report, and behind this, their sources, if you look at their references, is the Quilliam Foundation. They published a report called Music, Chess and Other Sins, right? And this is about Islamic education and Muslim schools, and anybody who's been involved in Muslim schools is mentioned in this report. I think, Brother Ibrahim, you actually escaped this. You escaped that one. I don't quite know how. You managed to stay under the radar, but Ibrahim Hewitt's in it, and the Association of Muslim Schools, Dr. Muqaddam. Anybody who's been doing anything is mentioned in this report, and the picture that's painted is that we're all these crazy extremists trying to... the word radicalise isn't that fashionable at that stage, but we're trying to... There's an Islamist ideology that is driving the Muslim schools movement in the UK, and certainly Shakhsiyah schools is mentioned as one of the most sort of dangerous, because there's this link with Hizb ut-Tahrir. Okay. The DFE's response to this, still the Labour government, is to conduct an Ofsted review and survey. So Ofsted have commissioned to go into Muslim schools and other faith schools and do a survey to see what's happening in faith schools. Is there some underground movement to try and, I don't know, overthrow the state or something along those lines? And they come back with a conclusion that no, there isn't. Everything's fine, there's no problem, and this report is published, and this is how this Civitas sort of fitna, if you like, is addressed. Come 2009, our schools become the focus of a huge sort of media attention, because a question is asked in Prime Minister's Questions by the then leader of the opposition, David Cameron, to I can't remember who was actually standing. I don't know who he asked. I never watched it, about our schools, about why funding has been given to schools run by Hizb ut-Tahrir. Okay, the funding they're referring to is the early years grant funding, but they didn't know that, because whoever's given them this information, and the word Quilliam is not far away from this, is giving them the impression that this is some sort of anti-radicalisation funding, which isn't the case at all. It's just literally we tried to stay independent of the state as much as possible, but we did. You can't pretty much run a preschool without getting the early years vouchers, because the way it's structured is virtually impossible to do that. So this is something that becomes a big issue. The Labour government actually respond and say that they looked at our school and they have no problem with the school, and Ofsted have looked at it and there's no worries. And the Charity Commission come in to investigate, and the report actually clears us and says that the extremist links are basically one of the mums who initially set it up. She's married to somebody from Hizb ut-Tahrir, and she was actually a member herself as well. And there's a couple who are members, but there's lots of others who aren't. And anybody who knows Hizb ut-Tahrir, they're sort of anti-setting up schools and things like that anyway. So the people who are from Hizb ut-Tahrir, this is not concerned with their work. But anyway, the Charity Commission said that that's fine as well. Of course, in 2010, you get a change of government. And once this change of government comes in, things begin to start rapidly changing. So in October 2010, we had the first inspection under Michael Gove. And what actually happens is inspectors come in and they, without telling us, do a session with the children, which is normal. Inspectors usually take some kids into a room and just talk to them about how they feel about the school. The children come out of this session crying, literally. And we kind of think about what's going on and what's happening. We talk to the kids, and it emerges that they've been asked questions about Khalifa, what's a Khalifa, about what do they think jihad is, about have they heard about bombs on trains. And the one that I think angered me the most was they were asked what they would do if their parents forced them to marry somebody. 9-year-old girl, right? 9-year-old girl. So we, sort of storm into the inspector's office and say to them that, what on earth is going on here? The children are upset, and they apologise at that point in time, and their response is, oh, but they said all the right things. You know, it was fine. They're really actually very well balanced. And you know, my response to them was, well, I don't need you to tell me that. You know, I don't need you to come and tell me that the kids are saying the right things. The whole point is, why are you asking them these questions? And you know, we put in a complaint. Anybody who's tried to complain about Ofsted, there is no process of complaint because they do not accept anything from anybody. So we went to the 2 or 3 different tiers, and it just doesn't get anywhere. We were also busy at that time trying to do a complaint against the media article because there were so many falsehoods in there, and that didn't get anywhere either, which didn't surprise us. Anyhow, the inspection finds SMSC good. Okay, so after this awful experience, we're fine in terms of our spiritual, moral, social, cultural. But what they do is they really home in on other areas and make things very difficult for us and failed school overall. Okay, when you get a different inspector come 6 months later, the school's turned around, and there's this sort of like, we say to them, how come it's turned around in 6 months kind of thing, and there's no explanation to this. Another thing to note is that in 2010 the Equality Act is passed, and there's a list of protected characteristics that come into force. This is going to come into play later on. Interestingly enough, the Charity Commission actually said to us at that point is that we're a women-only organisation set up by mums, and we've resisted various attempts by well-meaning fathers, in fact some from his Wadahari actually, to try and take over, because surely these mums don't quite know what they're doing. And we've definitely resisted that because we had a vision, an educational vision, which we knew that they did not understand, and what we were about was not what they were going to do. But the Charity Commission points out to us is that we can't officially say that we're a women-only organisation because that would be discrimination. Okay? Interesting. Right. So 2012, we're due. So we think, okay, fine, we've had this awful inspection, we've turned things round after this, and everything's fine now, things are settled down. 2012, we have 2 schools, by the way. The second school is due for an inspection, and we think, okay, fine, you know, we're happy for this. We've had two quite good reports in this branch. We've been doing quite well. But the inspection doesn't materialise. Instead, a request comes from the Department for Education for us to send our curriculum and schemes of work, our planning, to them, which is the first time that I've ever heard of this happening. So we send off our halakha curriculum and our schemes of work to them. And there's a response to this. And that response is really interesting, because the response is there's an amendment to the independent school standards, which is the law, now requiring schools to respect fundamental British values. And these British values are defined as individual liberty, the rule of law, democracy, and tolerance respect and tolerance of other cultures and beliefs. Okay, and this is quite interesting because what's coming out here, and I think it may be in the next slide, is that actually I'll come on to it, but this happens, and in May 2013, after this change, we get a second inspection in the second school under these new standards, and interestingly enough, the lead inspector from the first inspection, who we had complained about, is sent to our school, to the second school. So you've done a complaint about an inspector, and they send the same guy back. And this inspection is very different. They don't talk to the kids, they talk to us. They literally, I must have spent about 7 to 10 hours engaging in discussion with the inspectors, and it starts off with us just saying, look, you know, there's an agenda here and we're not happy about this, and and we're really, really sort of fiery, and they don't quite know what to do with us. And it kind of mellows over time into the point that before he left, he actually said, have you thought about doing outreach work, because what you're doing is really good. So things were raised such as this word shirk. We understand this is a derogatory word. And I'm saying, no, this word is just a descriptive word, and to understand tawheed, you have to understand shirk, and, you know, this is just a term which means partnership, and I'm trying to explain this. Questions are raised about, you say here in your curriculum that nationalism can be haram. What does that mean? And I said, well, you know, let me explain to you that right now Saudi Arabia is building a train between, I think, Arafah and Makkah, and depending on which country you come from, depends on whether you're able to use this train or not, and that there's a whole pecking order, and we want the children to understand that this kind of pecking order of the Saudi Arabs are the highest, then the other Arabs, and then you've got your various other things down to the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis, and right underneath is the black Africans, right? That we want the children to understand that this is haram, this is not right, this is not from Islam. And they're like, oh, I see. So you're okay if kids are waving the Union Jack? I said, I'm sure some of our kids were waving the Union Jack in the Jubilee, and, if they want to do that, then, that's up to them, right? So these are the kind of discussions we're having with them. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And they've obviously been given a brief that this is a dangerous idea, and this is a dangerous idea, and this is a dangerous idea. So anyhow, this inspection is actually also really positive. We get a wonderful report. SMSC is again found to be good, and they actually write that the halakha is a very useful pedagogy for developing autonomous critical thinking Muslims. So I think, okay, fine, got through that one. That's wonderful, right? And have a nice summer. Come October, we get a letter from the DFE saying that this has gone back to Mr. Gove, and Mr. Gove is not happy. He's not happy with Ofsted's findings. So even though Ofsted have been sent with this specific brief, he's still not happy. And apparently the law states that he has the right to overrule Ofsted, and he has decided that 2 of the independent school standards are not met and they're related to British values. And his issue is the concept that we teach the children the concept of khilafah, and we teach them about that sovereignty is to Allah. Right? And this is deemed in breach of the standards relating to respecting British values, and therefore we are failing, and they need an explanation to this. So at this point, we'd seek legal advice, and we go to quite a high-profile firm, and we get an education barrister involved, and we write back to them, explain to them that they've misread what is being said here, that what we're actually doing is teaching the children their history, their heritage, and sovereignty to Allah is actually like La ilaha illallah. This is something part of our Aqidah, is not really something we cannot teach. Because what they're saying is that because you teach sovereignty to Allah and you teach them that in Islam you have this ruling called khilafah, approach to ruling called khilafah, even though you're teaching them about democracy, because this becomes unbalanced, and therefore they're being taught that khilafah is better than democracy. Right? This is a conclusion that they draw. So we write back to them, and we have to submit an action plan. So we kind of make it clearer in our paperwork that what we're teaching them is a historical concept, and we're not having a discussion with the children about what they should be doing in terms of, we're teaching them the concept of democracy because we're actually obliged to, because this is part of your requirements, and we're teaching them about the issue became about Muslim Spain, right? So this is where they learn about what khilafah is, and what the fact you had these khalifas, and the fact they were accountable to the people, and how that was different to kingship, which was around in Europe, and how this is where this is being taught. So we put all this together and say, well, this is actually what's happening, and this should explain to you what's going on. So now you should, and that plan is accepted. And we think, okay, right, fine. So we haven't actually changed what we're doing. We've just explained it further. Now that's going to be sorted out. But what happens next? So May to July 2014, you get the Trojan Horse affair. And this is really interesting to us in Shakhsiyah, because remember that the independent school standards were amended after looking at our curriculum to sort of say that you have to respect these British values. Now with the Trojan Horse affair, I'm not going to go into too much about it, because I think most of you probably would have read a lot about it, and I've been talking a long time already. But the idea is that what is being fed to the media is that an ideology at odds with traditional British values is being pumped into schools. And what I've given on this slide is a letter by Sir Tim Brighouse, who's a former Chief Education Officer in Birmingham, and 20 other experts that write into the Guardian, I believe, and say that, and actually what's happening is Ofsted have adopted an ideology that's at odds with traditional British values. And they say that the government is at risk of compromising political independence by producing, Ofsted is at risk by producing tarnished reports. Their intervention comes days before Ofsted is going to publish these reports, which Michael Gove has commissioned into the Trojan Horse. And what's interesting is that not only do most of these schools have outstanding reports prior to the Trojan Horse allegations, but when the first set of Ofsted inspectors is sent in, they find nothing wrong. And then Mr. Govkamp gets involved, and he sends in a second set of inspectors, and they suddenly find evidence of extremism. So what is being said here is that further evidence emerged of abrupt shifts in Ofsted's inspection results, with a leaked inspection report showing that a second secondary school in the city has been previously rated good as outstanding, is expected to be downgraded is inadequate. And this mass inspection is described as a landmark in the history of education in these islands, and they are arguing that first-hand accounts of the Ofsted inspections that have emerged are disturbing. They suggest that inspectors were poorly prepared, had an agenda that calls into question their claims to be objective and professional, and they just begin to describe the kinds of experience that we've already had in our schools several times. Obviously, the government dismisses this. We will be publishing our findings early next week. These claims are baseless. Ofsted's Chief Inspector, Sir Michael Wilshire, had personal oversight of these inspections, which were carried out in very challenging circumstances. He's completely satisfied that his inspectors conducted themselves with great professionalism and integrity throughout the process. Right. What is the consequence of this? The consequence of this is the consultation on the updating the independent school standards even further, and now the requirement becomes not just respecting British values of individual liberty and democracy and so on, but to actively promote them. And for us sitting in Shakhsiyah, we're kind of sitting there thinking, okay, you had issues with us talking, just even teaching children the concept of Khilafah, for them to understand that you had Khilafah Rashida, that this is something that existed historically, and this is how Muslims organize themselves. That is a danger to the state, right? So now the requirement becomes that you have to actively promote democracy over an Islamic concept of ruling. So Western-style democracy. This consultation is conducted over the summer holidays. The outcome is published and the law comes into effect on the 29th of September. There's some of the documents that schools need to look at are available online on 29th of September, because I went and had a look, and we had a meeting and we printed them off, said, okay, everybody go home and read them. We'll meet again next week and discuss what to do. Some of them are not there. Okay. 30th of September, they turn up in our London school. We have 2 schools, right? No notice, 2 p.m., just turn up. And they're doing an inspection based on this that was half published yesterday, right? And this inspection is now taking it to a totally different level. And what we were unaware of is the same inspector that went into Park View and for the second round after the Trojan horse and found them failing in everything, so they went from outstanding to inadequate, is the one who's here. We don't know this at the time, but it's the same lady. They basically slate everything. We're inadequate in absolutely everything, down to our toilets failed because one hand dryer wasn't working and the boys' toilets were smelly. Okay, so on that basis, and we failed on that. The building is therefore inadequate, right? Everything is awful, absolutely everything. And interestingly enough, for SMSC, the issue of democracy, which had been the issue, we pass on that. Because we were so prepared for that we had everything ready, and they couldn't push it this way or the other. Our children were able to tell them what a coalition is and what the benefits and the advantages and disadvantages of it, and they were just like, they're talking to them at an adult level, because we'd done so much with the children about what democracy is and also how it has parallels in Islam, and in fact what we do with them in Muslim Spain is actually introduce to them the idea of being able to account a first amongst equals, i.e. a Khalif, comes into Europe through Muslim Spain, right? So there's a precursor to democracy through Islam, right? So we actually teach the children this. So we're fine on this, but we still fail on British values. And why do we fail on British values is down to the Equality Act 2010, which none of us actually understood this at the time because the guidance wasn't there. But what Ofsted now require is for schools to prepare children for life in modern Britain, so it's separate to British values now, by having due regard to the protected characteristics in the Equality Act. And the protected characteristics in the Equality Act are various, but they also include LGBT, which is obviously gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And Ofsted, at this, make a big issue of you are not teaching them about other lifestyles. We're talking about a primary school here. And the second thing is that they say there's too much Islam. So now we're not talking about balance as in, political balance, which was initially what the regulations were about, but they're now talking about the balance in the curriculum between Islam and non-Islam. And what they mean by that is because our curriculum is holistic and centered around this halakha, Islam is in everything. And they have issues with that. And their evidence is for things like, they say, you've got too many displays on Islam. Now at the time, you just sort of like bamboozled by this and you think, do we? And we showed them other displays that were not in Islam. After they left, we counted. So in our corridors, we had, I think, 27 displays, and 17 were not on Islam. Okay, and I counted amongst the 10 that were in Islam, displays in the Arabic language, which just, even though they were on transport, just assuming that they would have thought they're on Islam. Okay, so let's give them benefit of the doubt. But that is too much Islam. So we failed that we don't have balance because there's too much Islam, and because we haven't taught our children about gay lifestyles. And this is really sort of like, we just don't quite know what to do with this. And it's almost like they've left, and I think there's 6 schools in Tower Hamlets that are inspected at the same time, have the same experience, and they just totally leave you sort of, they bulldozed you downtown, and you're like, you don't know how to react. Interestingly enough, sex and relationships education is not mandatory in schools. In independent schools. So there's no law in the independent school standards that you have to teach sex education. And parents have the right to withdraw even if the school chooses to teach it. We've never taught it. It's not something that we think is our role. We think this is a parental role. We still have this very much idea. We say to our parents, you're educating the kids, we're just here to help you. But the DFE and Ofsted are looking at learning about gay lifestyles as separate to SRE. So you have to teach them about gay lifestyles, but you don't have to teach them about sex. Okay, so this becomes interesting. The Jewish schools have begun a legal challenge, but we've been informed that we will be inspected before that legal challenge comes through, and they will expect to see our children have knowledge of this. Okay. Association of Muslim Schools is actually quite quiet, and schools themselves, although the 6 Tower Hamlet schools have come together, are working together, but generally speaking, schools are not really communicating with AMS, and there's no unity amongst the Muslims as to how to deal with this now, because now you've gone from what could potentially, you might think, okay, they might have a point, there's a political issue here, or this could be some sort of threat to the state. Now it's gone down to just basic Islamic beliefs about certain, how we conduct our relationships. Right, so conclusion. This is where we're now at as Muslims. The questionable evidence, and I'm quoting again from Alexander, on which key educational policies are now talking back to the wider context of even literacy, numeracy, national curriculum and so on. There's no evidence for why the government does what it does. It's very questionable. There's a disenfranchising of local voice. So a government that's purporting that we have to teach democracy is disenfranchising professionals from actually having any kind of say in what's happening. There's a rise of unelected and unaccountable groups taking key decisions behind closed doors. What Gove's policies are very much, you can see in Civitas and Central Social Cohesion reports before that. And in fact, Mr. Gove is an advisor to these think tanks. There's empty rituals of consultation, and I think even the British Values one over the summer holidays, over a 6-week period, who's going to respond? Authoritarian mindset and use of myth and derision to underwrite exaggerated accounts of progress and discredit any alternative views, that's a general problem. We then see that focusing down onto the Muslim schools, and it becomes much, much more sinister in how it's operating. And I'm going to end with the quote that I began with from Lovett, who said that while we are anxious to see a general system of education adopted, we have no doubt that the impropriety of yielding such an important duty as the education of our children to any government, to any state, if ever knavery and hypocrisy succeed in establishing the centralising state model and knowledge-forcing scheme in England, which it has, so assuredly will the people degenerate into passive submission to injustice, and I'm talking about the Muslims now, and the spirit sink into this pestilential calm of despotism. And just to end with Surah Al-Asr, which is sunnah to end with that anyhow, but a reflection that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, asr, by time, that we are in loss, that insan is in loss, and insan, this despotism is there, and there is this calm about it that nobody seems to be bothered about. But that is the constancy and the sabr and the haqq that needs to be brought together, and that's the only thing that you kind of sort of pin yourself down to, is that this is what is needed for us to weather this kind of storm and this kind of battle that we've been having with the state, and whether we should be organic or not. I'm happy to discuss, I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm happy to take questions on whether we should have ever registered and whether we should perhaps think about deregistering. But there's seriously an issue with becoming anywhere part of the system. There's some references there, and I think we can send this out as a PDF, so there's actual links to a lot of these references, because I was asked to give references. But inshallah, that's the end of my presentation. I don't know how long I was speaking for. But yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.